The farmer is the chosen servant to produce from the soil enough to sustain the living. Considering this, the farmer needs to have a massive amount of education. It's a very complicated job. They are a businessman, but it goes way beyond that because they have to understand animals. They also have to understand how to plant things, being an agronomist, a veterinarian. They also need to love to fix things as a mechanic. They need to be able to operate machines. They also need to be able to manage potentially employees as well as managing a business. There's so much more than even that goes into farming. And considering this, farmers need no education to get into farming, oftentimes just learning from their parents. And that's fine, and oftentimes very good. But if there's a lack of education in the older generation, and the newer generation does not pursue it themselves, you can see over a long term, lack of education is going to have a major negative effect on the role of farmer. Farmers are going to struggle. In fact, W.D. Hoard of the Hoard Dairymen was adamant that this was a huge problem. He says, in 1889, one reason why there is so much truth in the reiterated remark, farming don't pay, is that there is not another business on the face of the earth that supports so many incompetents. They didn't know what they were doing for the vast majority of them. And this frustrated Hoard to no end, which is why he created his magazine, to encourage farmers to learn how to do things better. There is a picture of W.D. Hoard, and I will reference him on occasion in this presentation. So there was this myth, and I've already kind of talked about this, the dumb farmer myth. And where does that come from? Well, it's a clinging to the past, being used to what they've done and not really wanting to consider something new. This is a natural human tendency. It's also a different mindset. As a farmer, you might not think about your farm as a business. It's your livelihood, sure, but you might not think of it as a business. You might think, these are my animals. These are maybe not pets, because they are your livelihood, but you might not consider selling a certain animal if it's not producing enough food or milk because you like that animal. There's an emotional aspect to farming, and that can make it difficult for some farmers to step away and look at it strictly from a business standpoint. There's a different mindset there. Not all farmers have that, but it is something that can have an effect. They're going to make dumb business decisions based on emotional attachments to the land, and to the past, and to their animals. Successful farming came out with this not so politically correct statement, must improve human breed. Definitely won't see that in today's Successful Farming magazine. But the point being, it wasn't a cow problem, it was a man problem. They did not know how to properly raise their animals to produce quality milk. There was a massive educational movement that started in the Civil War. The Morrill Act of 1862, signed in by Lincoln, gave universities land grants in the Midwest. And those land grants produced universities like University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Minnesota. And for the first time, these universities started developing new research, developed more on a scientific side of things, rather than the traditional education of the past, of just studying past knowledge and studying that in-depthly. Their goal was to actually produce new knowledge and new research. And part of this, and a major part of this, was for farming, how to do farming better. So these universities all have agricultural extension services, and the purpose then was they could learn something in the lab, they could learn something on their test farms, and then they could take that into the communities and explain to farmers how to do things a little bit differently. Great example of this, an 1898 book, Feeds and Feeding by W.A. Henry, taught farmers for the first time how to feed animals in a scientific way to provide the best quality milk and the best health for those animals. And there's a huge number of farming periodicals that popped up at the turn of the century, again trying to educate farmers to become better farmers. There are many educational topics that farmers needed to understand at this time. And going to the universities, taking short courses to really understand some of these key aspects were things that were actually happening. That's actually what this picture is a young farmer studying to do farming better. Taking a look at these topics, monitoring herd yields was such an important thing. How much milk are the cows actually producing? This could give the farmer the opportunity to, if a cow was not producing well, to maybe decide to sell it, to market for meat, or change around its food to see what the best food rations would be to produce more milk. Understanding this could allow farmers to have maybe potentially less animals, feed them the same amount of food, and produce more profit, because those animals would be the highest yielding animals, instead of having a few low yield animals pulling down the entire herd and stealing all the profits. Feed rations. I mentioned The Feeds and Feeding was such an important book to change the way farmers understood how to feed their animals. It matters what they're eating. They need good nutrition to produce good quality milk and be healthy animals to live long, sustainable lives, to produce a profit for the farmers. Here's a big one, and the reason they even got into dairying was proper manure management. They needed to bring fertility back to the land. And that was great, but if they don't use their manure properly, it would all be for naught. This ad sharing with farmers, your soil is alive. There's bacteria, there are nutrients in the soil that can be fed and nourished and brought back to it through the use of manure. Unfortunately, the management of the manure at the time was incredibly poor. It was very common for farmers, out of somewhat laziness, but also necessity, probably didn't have the time, didn't know any better. They would throw their manure out the barn window into a large pile, and then they would hope and cross their fingers that it would snow and rain enough that enough of that pile would run off and run away that they wouldn't have to haul that away in the spring, and it would take away from a lot of their work. But they didn't understand that they were leaching all the nutrients out of this manure. They were not managing it at all, and all the positive things, the potash and the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the organic material was not getting put back into the soil. It was filtering off into the stream, like in this picture, going into the land around the farm. In fact, it was observed that farmland around the barns typically had much higher yields than farmland further away from the barns because of the way they were managing manure. Just another example of what farmers were allowing to happen. Let's let all these natural things run off the positive nutrients that they were paying for in fertilizers that they were putting on their land. But it was all there in the manure, and it was being wasted. Millions of dollars down the drain out of pure ignorance. So they shared with them different ideas of how to manage manure. Having a manure pit that was covered in a shed that would allow the manure to maintain its fertility so that it could be put out on the land. Another example of a manure shed that would protect that manure, that valuable asset for the farmer, the most valuable, but also teaching them how to better manage how they spread it. It was not uncommon for farmers to throw it out in piles and again let the rain just wash it away. Easier for them, doesn't take them a whole lot of time. They also discovered that naturally the grass or whatever was growing there grew better under these piles. Farmers needed to get away from this. They also could spend a lot of time spreading these piles out evenly. That's where the invention of the manure spreader becomes so important. Here the guy is spreading it by hand. Better than the first two pictures, but still very time consuming and not nearly as effective and not nearly as a full cover. The invention of the manure spreader would was a substantial thing to help farmers manage manure better. In fact, that the manure spreader, not the tractor, not any of the other things, manure spreader is the most important invention in farming history. The invention of the manure spreader ought to be hailed as more momentous than the plow or the automobile, but probably no technological wonder is as ill thought of than the manure spreader. And I get it. You know why? It's because it stinks. It smells awful. And yet it's so important to bring that fertility back to the soil. And it is very important. Getting back to those educational topics, the role of bacteria was significantly underestimated by farmers up until this time. They didn't really get it. But educating farmers on this would help them understand how to provide a better environment for their animals and a better environment for the milk they're providing to their customers. It was not uncommon for farmers to leave their milk in the milk house for a few days before taking it to market. It was also not uncommon for many infants to die from raw milk, which led to the pasteurization of milk on a 100% scale, even to this day. It was this mismanagement and misunderstanding of the role of bacteria that caused so many catastrophic events. Teaching farmers to understand that sunlight would actually clean the air naturally and kill bad bacteria. That cleaning the feed troughs of the animals and the water tanks and keeping the barn as clean as possible would be better for their animals and better for their product they were producing. Milk and cheese quality was of utmost importance. As I mentioned earlier, Wisconsin needed to create a market for milk and cheese. And we know Wisconsin today as America's dairyland, but that was not always what it was. Wisconsin was actually a place that nobody would want to buy cheese from. It was so bad that Europeans refused to buy anything but New York cheese. Wisconsin cheese farmers were known for cutting corners, adding vegetable oils to their cheese to increase profits and save money. Clearly, very low quality, not something other people wanted to be eating. They are also commonly known to water down their milk. More milk meant more money. That's where the Babcock test comes into play. The Babcock test finally gave a way for factories and milk producers to prove the quality of their milk. The fat content of their milk could be tested quickly and prices be given accordingly. The basic essentials of the Babcock test is a centrifuge that would allow whoever was running it to determine the milk fat. The milk fat, higher the milk fat content, the higher the quality, the better premium price it would get. Finally, air quality. Tuberculosis was a huge issue for farmers, as it would spread throughout their animals and cause them to die, and also spread to their families. Understanding this diagram is teaching farmers to build their barns for proper movement of air, so fresh air could be constantly cycled through the barn. This was known as the King system of ventilation, and allowed that air to move through so that fresh air would be constantly replaced, so the tuberculosis would not be stagnant in that stale air and easily spread from animal to animal.